Bernie Yokel and his family live in a coastal swamp in South Florida. The mosquitoes and snakes that breed here spoil his pleasure in swamp life not at all. He is a marine biologist, conducting research on the functioning of one piece of coastal wetland and its importance to life in the sea. And in this Florida swamp, Bernie Yokel's work and his pleasure are also inextricably linked.
Go catch a gopher turtle?
I can't believe that. Did you see that gopher turtle out there? No.
Looked like he couldn't submerge.
Did you ever sit here? There he is.
Yeah, he's alive.
Yeah, he must be hurt.
He's way out of his element.
Why is he in the water?
He might have gotten caught trying to cross a creek or something and is getting swept out to sea.
Small one. Right on target. Ducks in. Oh, nice. A wet turtle. They came out here. Now, what's he doing out here?
I've never seen one out here before. Put him down on deck.
Bernie's base of operation is Rookery Bay Sanctuary, a 6,000-acre estuary that was saved from being dredged and filled when a group of private citizens raised money and purchased it.
We're coming into Hidden River, which is a little mangrove-lined channel that loops up into the upland parts of the sanctuary. These are all...
Until recently, our coastal wetlands, which consist of swamps, bays, grassy marshes, and estuaries like this one, were regarded as wasteland. Private developers were encouraged to dredge and fill such worthless real estate and to convert it into high-priced waterfront property. No one suspected the real value of coastal wetlands. No one realized what was their true function. No one knew that our worthless wetlands are wellsprings for life in the sea. Even from our ordinary earthbound perspective, it is easy to see that islands and peninsulas are projections of land. Less obvious to us land dwellers is the fact that the reverse is equally true. Bays, estuaries, and wetlands are part of the sea. And though most of us, when we think of seashores, tend to picture sandy beaches, in truth, swamps, grassy marshes, and estuaries like these dominate all coastlines. Until recently, these ragged edges of the ocean were thought to have no value to man. Even their function as buffer zones, protecting the land from storms and the eroding action of the sea, was given little attention. That such wastelands could be nutrient-rich havens and nursery grounds for marine life was not even guessed. But lately, scientists have begun taking a closer look at wetlands. Depending on altitude and climate, vegetation differs up and down our coastline. Yet wetlands of all types support an impressive array of life. We will look at how the mangrove-lined estuaries of South Florida produce a pyramid of marine life extending far out to sea. But what is true of mangrove swamps holds equally true for grassy marshes on the Atlantic states or the juncus beds of the Gulf of Mexico. Our coastal wetlands, wherever they occur, are one of our most valuable resources.
These areas are really unique. They're doing something very special for us, and that specialty is producing food. These regions produce food without parallel in the natural environment. They produce more food per unit area, per acre, or whatever you want to use, than any other natural area. They compare very favorably with agriculture, where you have to plow and you have to cultivate and you have to harvest and you have to apply fertilizers and oftentimes pesticides. And there's a great deal of labor and investment involved. These areas do all of this, and they don't require any investment of labor or materials on our part at all. The red mangrove has several functions in the overall system. one of the important ones, as you can see with this rather large tree here, is it consolidates this shore. It holds that bay system together, ties up the sediments, makes a marvelous storm barrier, protecting the shoreline and the things behind it from storm waves. It's also a major source of food in the estuarine system, and the estuaries are incredibly efficient at producing food, and the mangroves, especially the red mangroves, are extremely useful as a source of detrital food. The word detritus means little tiny particles of plant material or leaf material. You can see leaves floating around these areas all the time. And these leaves, of course, come from the red mangrove. They fall in the water, they take on water and sink to the bottom, and eventually become coated with microorganisms, with bacteria, with fungus. And these microorganisms break down the leaf matter so that it can be consumed by the animals. And the animal actually consumes the leaf, but takes good advantage of the microorganisms that sit like a frosting on the surface of the leaf. The little piece of leaf is then excreted, and it moves off into the water, perhaps being carried by tide, and becomes a little tiny pepper speck or piece of detritus. And it grows its own new colony of microorganisms and might be transported a long distance to be consumed by another animal, either on bottom or an oyster hanging on a mangrove root. All of these animals undergo a part or all of their life history in regions like this, and many of them consume a secondary source of food. That is, an animal that has been feeding off of this basic productivity and is in the form of a pinfish, perhaps, or a little sardine, or a small crab. So you have the beginnings of a magnificent food chain that culminates in the things that we regard as very valuable. The capacity for the area to support birds, our sport fisheries, our food fisheries, the capacity for the area to cleanse its own waters and to keep it clean. But their most important function, certainly, of the red mangrove is as a food source, and the detrital food chain is a very important one in estuarine systems like this. So you get this reward, you get this bounty from the estuaries simply because you let it alone.
The routine work of a marine biologist is less glamorous and more grueling than many TV adventure stories suggest. It is 3:30 in the morning. Bernie and his assistant Bob Rabinski are only now completing their final trawl of Rookery Bay Sanctuary.
Yeah, it's 7 without a hitch. Ready? Ready!
Each trawl must be precisely timed to last exactly 2 1/4 minutes, so that the catch can be compared to other 2 1/4 minute trawls made on previous nights. By this means, Bernie monitors the productivity of one unspoiled piece of coastal wetland.
You got a gallon?
Oh, 5 gallons. How about that?
Sold.
Bet you could make a lot of nice fish soup out of that.
Very little variation in these tonight. They're extremely consistent.
Yeah. Ooh, well, nice one. Got me bum.
Come on down there, Mr. Pinfish. Oh, hey, look at the puffer. Oh, man, are those spines sharp. Wow. Full of water.
It was only in 1969 that two scientists, Dr. Eric Heald and Dr. William Odom, first demonstrated that surplus leaves from the mangrove tree form the food base for a magnificent web of animal life, stretching far out into the ocean. Since then, many scientists have been exploring the myriad pathways of this food chain. They are discovering a cat's cradle of intricate relationships. Some strands ascend to our valuable sports and commercial fisheries. Others extend even to the beautiful coral reef on the edge of the continental shelf. Still others, with the help of fishing birds, spin out of the water to sustain terrestrial life.
Preservative is rough. Come on, Brian. Come up here.
First of all,
It's going to require some additional length. Sit right here. What you're going to do is separate the material into 3 containers, one for fish, one for crustaceans, and one for the rest of the animals. These animals are intermediate links in the food chain. They're taking advantage of the grass as a source of food and protection from larger predators, and will support animals like trout and redfish. These animals must go to sea to spawn. This is especially true of the pinfish and the pink shrimp. The pink shrimp, when he hatches from the egg out on the Tortugas, is barely visible, and yet he undergoes a migration of several hundred miles. He comes into these areas, grows rapidly because food is abundant, and then moves back out to the same area again. And it's an awkward sort of life cycle, and it's very much dependent upon the estuaries where it can find the quantity of food that it requires.
The fantastic 200-mile round-trip journey of the pink shrimp perfectly demonstrates how life in the coastal wetlands and life in the open sea are interdependent. On a more subtle plane, it also connects the work of widely separated human beings. Out here in the region of dry Tortugas, few fishermen are aware of what biologists are discovering about the migratory habits of pink shrimp. Some might be surprised to learn that the pink gold they are mining must spend its early life in a distant estuary. These men possess a different kind of expertise.
I think that's bad medicine, sharks. They cut up your webbing, and they might cut you if you be down there with them.
Well, there are dangerous fish, sharks and barracudas out here. We have 2 dangerous fish. They bite or cut you, and then they cut the net. And this time, I think this is one of the baddest months we have in the year, June. It'll start picking up now from now on. It'll pick up gradually better and better. But it's been pretty bad, so this month. So. See, this go by the moon.
While sharks may annoy Captain Virgil Matthews, they present no realistic threat to the success of his operation. Pink shrimp burrow under the sandy bottom by day, and so he and his mate, Eugene Charles, fish at night. Without discussion, they ready the trawl net for the drop. Though the weather is marginal, the trawl begins. If the sea becomes turbulent, the men will have to pull in their nets. That will mean profit loss and more nights at sea. Under the best of conditions, shrimp fishermen do not put into shore for 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. The first drag is finished, and the men will soon find out how well they picked their fishing ground. The haul is a big one, at least 1 1/2 tons. Though a large percentage are trash fish, the shrimp landed here will contribute to the $100 million catch made annually along the coasts of the United States. Shrimp, our most valuable seafood resource, bring in more dollars to the fishing industry than salmon and tuna combined. Moreover, the shrimp boom creates related jobs. More than half the fishing boats constructed in the United States are shrimp trawlers. And in still another spin-off, shrimp processing plants employ large workforces. All of this employment is dependent upon the preservation of coastal wetlands. Yet, coastal wetlands continue to be destroyed even while consumer demand for shrimp is growing. At the present time, the United States imports more shrimp than it is able to catch. Ironically, this favorite food of Americans is being purchased from several protein-hungry nations, including India and Mexico. But the immediate concern of these highly skilled Americans is their own survival and future.
So you have 8 hours of work and 12 hours of sleep. Well, that takes up the day right there.
It's all right for a single man, but it ain't so pretty good for a married man. Well, you get lonesome when you leave the sea buoy. You know you have 15, 20 days on the bow before you can get back to the dock. I think I want to do something to you. Change you.
It makes you think you're stronger and tougher than the next fellow because you've been out in the ocean. That's fun. If all the shrimp disappear, you try some other type of fishing. Once you get accustomed to this type of work, you wouldn't want to do anything else other than this.
Once a fisherman, always a fisherman. It gets in his blood, it just won't get out. I've been doing this since ever since 1927. I stop every once in a while, but I wind right back up on the shrimp boat.
At dawn, the shrimp sorting is completed, and the bottlenose dolphins know it. They gather around the boat for the dumping of the trash fish. Even the waste product of this industry is returned to nature in a form that can be recycled into the food chain.
You can throw some fish overboard, and within 30 minutes' time, you'll have 15 or 20 of them right there diving, eating the fish. And I don't understand how they do it from boat to boat. One boat will throw his fish overboard. They'll eat up him, and then 30 minutes, another boat throw his fish overboard. They go from one boat to another one, start eating fish. I don't believe they ever full up. I don't believe they get full. Then they'll go and play. Just play with one another for a while after they get to eat, after all the food's gone. I'm happy to see them survive and have plenty of food when you catch it for them.
100 miles away, another creature that is dependent on coastal wetlands is the comical pelican. Like man, this fish eater feeds high on the food chain. And its survival or decline can be viewed as an indicator of problems that might, in time, affect human populations. In recent years, the brown pelican's failure to hatch young put it on the endangered species list. Reasons for its decline? Pesticide residue in eggs, contamination of the fish it eats, and habitat destruction. In this important remaining rookery or breeding place in southwest Florida, young are still being hatched and reared. But a proposed real estate development nearby threatens to destroy the parent bird's fishing grounds.
The rookeries support an unknown number of birds. I've never really had an opportunity to count them. There have to be thousands that roost there and probably thousands that nest there. And they include endangered species like the brown pelican and a host of the birds that give this area its charm and attractiveness. They use the small fishes that surround the mangrove islands as the food for both themselves and for their young. Those birds are there because they can make a living there, and they need to make a living very easily and nearby in order to feed their young when they're nesting. The big controversy that faces South Florida is how to develop and keep the very things that make it attractive and saleable intact. You simply can't continue to tear up and destroy the very essence of the attractiveness of the area, the usefulness of the area, and expect it to continue to function as a source of recreation, as a source of beauty. The data that we and many others have come up with show very clearly that these resources are necessary for Florida. They urgently need to maintain their good game fishing, their clean waters, and the populations of birds that give it color and aesthetic beauty. We're not opposed to development. We simply want to put development where it belongs, and it does not belong in the wetlands. The wetlands are too large a resource, too important a resource for the public benefit to disrupt them. They produce an annual benefit, an annual revenue, and all we need to do to keep that revenue coming in and to maintain something unique and extremely beneficial is to leave it alone.
They are beautiful, and don't forget that that's most of the real estate of the Keys were made up of the mangroves. As we're going on out into the ocean, folks, if you can hear me over there, have any of you all ever seen the large bird nest that builds these nests above the telephone poles coming down from Homestead? Great big nest on the top of the poles. You know what kind of bird that is? Osprey. Right. As we Southerners say, the osprey is a kissing cousin of your American bald eagle.
How important the aesthetic byproducts of wetlands are to Florida can be expressed concretely in dollars and cents. 26 million people visit the state annually. During their stay, they spend $6.5 billion. What attracts tourists to Florida are her natural areas, places where people can enjoy outdoor experiences and unique sights. And one of the most unique sights found anywhere in America, the nation's only living coral reef, is located off the east coast of Florida. It is a spawning ground for countless numbers of beautiful tropical sea animals.
We often see turtles out here on the inner reef, usually in your turtle grass, feeding on it. We occasionally see sharks, and as I said before, we do see barracuda. Although we have seen both, there has not been any reported attack of either one.
Like Pikes Peak or the Grand Canyon, the coral reef is one of America's treasures. But probably few people who visit the reef are aware that its survival is linked to the preservation of Florida's wetlands. For unlike Pikes Peak or the Grand Canyon, the coral reef is not made of rock, but is composed of billions of tiny living animals. And like all animal colonies, in order to survive, the reef, too, must eat. Dr. Dennis Taylor of the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences tells how the coral reef is nourished in part from sediments washed out from the mangrove swamps.
Well, the mangroves are the start of what we would call a detrital food system. And what this essentially means is that the mangroves themselves produce plant material which falls from the trees and which is eventually decayed by microorganisms, usually fungi and bacteria. And this decayed material then is washed away in the water column either as compounds dissolved in seawater or as particles. And it's fair to say that the nutrients produced in mangroves and in the bay system are not the total requirement of the coral. They're a major portion of it.
In his underwater laboratory, Dr. Taylor measures the metabolism of a piece of coral to better understand its food requirements.
The animals that we were using are two corals, two types of brain coral. Most people do not know that they're an animal. They tend to regard them either as plants or colorful rocks. And then, in fact, they are many animals. They're a colony of many individuals. And this is what usually forms what's referred to as a coral head or a coral colony. And each of these animals that lives in this colony has living inside of its tissues very small microscopic algae or plants. And these are single-celled plants. And like all plants, they're capable of manufacturing food from sunlight and carbon dioxide, which is a gas dissolved in seawater. And the food which they manufacture, they use for their own growth. They also are able to excrete and transport this food to the animal, and the animal uses that for its nutrition and growth. And both of these individuals that form this association are very dependent upon food levels in the water as well. What the algae can produce is only a part of the food economy of a coral. And the remainder of it must come from either living plants or animals in the water, or dissolved food which is in the water itself. It comes from the coastal zone, the coastal wetlands. So that you see here on the fringe of the continental shelf, in Florida at least, and then throughout most of the Caribbean, a coral reef community which exists on the edge of a much broader community. And there are a series of food and nutritional interrelationships between corals and the grass beds and the mangrove swamps. I think one of the things which you must remember in this area is that it's an area of very high temperature, particularly in the summer, and this also makes it a marginal environment. It's a very difficult life for an organism in the tropics because it's continually under stress, mostly temperature stress. And this makes energy demands very high. And if you interfere with the food resource in an ecosystem such as this, even one aspect of it, the total effect which you could potentially have is very large. And this is another thing which we know very little about.
In reality, natural systems have no definable boundaries. Even as the mangrove leaf provides a food base for far-flung life, so the mangrove tree itself requires nutrition in order to manufacture its valuable leaf crop. It uses dissolved nutrients carried from inland water systems, which, in accord with natural law, always flow seaward. If this water is not diverted, it regularly enters the coastal wetlands, causing mangrove trees to thrive and produce many leaves. These, in turn, support large numbers of animals. To better understand how mangrove trees vary in their capacity to produce leaves, Dr. Sam Snedeker of the University of Florida has set up an ingenious experiment, one that requires his crew to get their feet wet.
Then we have the new chamber for the large tree. I want you to get that completely rigged up. Make sure it's sealed so there are no leaks in it. We have to work quickly in case it rains, and we will be able to seal the bag properly.
Up and over the tree.
To find out how productive the tree is, these technicians must perform an awkward operation.
Okay, it's up to you now, Chuck. Yeah, I know. What's holding me? The gas line. I'm hooked under that limb down there. Watch your heads out there.
Over this branch right here, okay?
Chuck? And you can roll it right in back here. We can get it down on this side. Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes in through here.
Huh?
It goes in through here. We're going to tape it
Yeah,
to this
right.
side. Okay.
Got to get it over this branch here, though.
Wait a minute.
Can you use the...
I think I can get up one.
No, don't break.
No, I'm not going to.
That's right, Chuck. Bring it. The chamber is rigged up so that the incoming air goes into the bottom of the chamber and comes out the top. In addition, we take a sample of the air going in and a sample of the air coming out. We also measure the temperature and the airflow velocity. The sample of air that goes back to the instruments in the tent is used to determine the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air going in, the concentration in the air coming out, and also the water vapor. From determining the difference between what goes in and what comes out, we're able to monitor or actually measure photosynthesis and respiration, and also the amount of transpiration that occurs simultaneously with those measurements. Basically, if we know the metabolism of a tree, it's like knowing the metabolism of a person. We know how healthy it is. there's a great difference in the metabolism of mangrove trees depending on where they are. Some are very productive, some are less productive. In terms of maintaining the health of mangroves, no matter where they are located, they need two things. They need a source of nutrients from upland sources, runoff, drainage from upland forest areas, grasslands, whatever. And they also need a regular, normal pattern of tidal flushing. In other words, a mechanism for bringing the nutrients to the plant and carrying away waste. The source of nutrients almost exclusively comes from further inland. It doesn't come from the oceans, but they come from the upland system. But any type of barrier, for instance a bulkhead, which is set up, which stops either of those flows, then we see situations in which the mangroves are severely altered, and we might expect that they are damaged in terms of their contribution to the downstream estuary. The statement was made that if mangroves are so important to fisheries, then all we need to do is to, you might say, literally have mangrove farms where we raise mangroves for the detritus to benefit the fisheries. We could then have very neat areas of residential development, other types of development in mangroves. We have our mangrove farms producing detritus, and everything appears to be perfectly in balance. What we failed to remember in this regard is that a mangrove farm in such a context would be a management enterprise by man. It would be very expensive. You can look at the type of habitat here and see very easily that it is not amenable to heavy equipment, to farming machinery, to anything that we associate with agriculture. Of course, it can be done, but the cost would be tremendous. We can have the same product from two different systems. One cost man and cost as economy. It's a work service. It has to be paid for with dollars and fossil fuels and natural resource. Whereas at the other extreme, we can have the very same product absolutely free of charge to man's economy, courtesy of nature.
Estuaries not only plant and harvest themselves, they also freely transport their produce from lower to higher consumer on waters that are never still.
What you're seeing is a mangrove leaf with a little passenger, a swimming crab, and they'll frequently cling, these little crabs will cling to a piece of floating material and use it as a raft to carry them about in the estuary.
But in the wetlands, water does more than transport food. It is as essential an element of life as the detrital food chain itself.
What you need to understand, along with the capacity for these areas to support food, is an estuary, by definition, is where the seawater and the freshwater get together. And in southwest Florida, this wetland area where sea and freshwater mix is an especially useful region. And over a long, long period of time, geologic time, the system has developed such that the freshwater moves off of the land through the marshes very slowly and very shallow flows. It's not river-like, it's sheet-like. And it moves through the marshes, and all the time it's being processed. And because it moves slow, it can't carry much dirt or silt. And when the water ultimately arrives in the estuarine area, in the mangrove areas, it's clean. But then man felt that he needed living area, and he's made some very destructive changes. He's built canals, drainage canals, that takes the fresh water very quickly, bypasses the marsh, bypasses the filtration and the settling characteristics of the marsh, and brings it into the estuary almost instantaneously. And the net result is that the fertilizers, the nutrients, the dirt, the silt, and all of this fresh water arrive in the estuarine area very suddenly, and it causes a great many problems. It creates problems because nutrients wash off of agricultural areas or off of lawns and come into these canals, and they're not removed by the marshes, but they're brought down immediately into the estuary and create big problems in the sense of stimulating simple plants so that you have an overabundance of those simple plants and the system gets out of balance. For every change we make, there's a penalty we have to pay.
Impeding the flow of fresh water into the wetlands can have a catastrophic effect on animals, too. The juvenile animals that inhabit wetlands are adapted to life in water that is salty one day and fresh the next. As these individuals mature, however, they require a more stable environment and they move into the ocean. Their departure makes the coastal wetlands safe for the next generation of young. But man, by interfering with the normal flow of fresh water into estuaries, often creates saline conditions that adult fish and marine predators find comfortable. They therefore remain in or enter these nursery zones and prey upon the young. While such a situation may temporarily delight fishermen, in the long run, it will severely cripple their sport.
Boy, is that a nice trout.
Wow.
How many of those trout did you catch?
How many we got?
A survey of fishermen is being conducted by Everglades National Park biologists to determine if adult fish and predators are indeed beginning to invade coastal nursery zones.
About another dozen and a half.
Okay, did you release anything else?
Everything. Sailor's choice, grunts, catfish. What about the little shark? Little shark.
Okay, now
Killed the shark out there.
slow up a little bit for me, please. You released one shark. Yeah.
Killed one shark.
Our task in this is first to document what's going on, to define this is really what's happening.
Biologist Gary Davis of Everglades National Park discusses the long-range implications of man's manipulation of water systems with Tom Schmidt and his team of biological technicians.
You interpret for me.
Well, what I was asking you was, do you see the kind of change that we're seeing? For instance, with the trout. You were just talking about you saw a lot of big trout.
The trout look like they're getting older.
Third and fourth year class.
Yeah, they're catching fewer fish, but the ones they're catching are larger. Right. Yeah. Instead of an estuary system where we got a lot of fresh water flowing into the system, now we're starting to get increased salinities, kind of a coastal marine thing where we have more adult animals involved. So we're catching fewer, but they're larger.
We do have quite a few fishermen that are going just for shark. But there's so many released. Do you think there's a greater number of predators, both barracuda and shark now?
Seems to be a trend. We're losing the nursery ground where we have the young fish being produced. They're being replaced by the larger predators, the adult redfish, the barracuda and sharks that you're talking about. So it's still a productive area, but in a different sort of way. Instead of having the nursery zone, we're losing that, and in the long run, we're going to lose that whole fishery. We control the flow of water into the park through the gates of the Tamiami Canal and the other water delivery systems. And the trick is to manage the system so that we recreate the natural flow of water through the slough, into the estuary, and into this coastal zone. It's a matter of balancing the quality of the water, the quantity of the water, and the timing, the seasonality of when it flows. This whole system is balanced to a marked wet and dry season. And if by our artificial manipulations we extend the wet season halfway through the dry season, you see, we're going to defeat that balance. And there are a lot of things that are key to this timing. The shrimp that come up from Tortugas on the grounds have to come into an estuary that has the right water levels and the right salinity conditions. We have to balance the water flow in the system for the wading birds that feed on the edge of the slough. If it doesn't dry up early enough for them so that it concentrates the fish they can eat, they don't have food for their young. And so they can't feed the young, and the young die. And that's what's happened over the last 10 years with the wood stork population. Same thing is true of when we raise the water levels. We have to be careful of things like alligators out in the slough system, because the alligators are building nests. They lay their eggs, and then the water level rises through the rainy summer season, and we'll flood those nests if we flood it too high. The alligators have figured out over the years about how high they have to build those nests to keep the eggs from being flooded. So we have to balance, quality, quantity, and timing so that we don't mess up all the ecological systems that have been matched to that water flow, the natural, unimpeded water flow.
Guess what?
What?
I think that's it.
Dr. Jim Cushlan is a biologist who is studying the nesting habits of wild alligators. Unarmed, He and his wife, Marilyn, slosh through the swamps of the Everglades searching for nestlings to capture and tag. Together, they also collect data on drowned-out nests. With this information, Cushlan will recommend to the engineers who manage 4 critical locks, called the S12 structures, how best to release the park's quota of fresh water. For unless the water enters the park in a manner that imitates natural runoff, many animals will fail.
The large male, and he's probably the one that lives in a pond just on the other side of that hammock there.
A mother alligator is unusual in the reptilian world. Like a bird or a mammal, she will defend her nest and come to the aid of a baby in distress. An irate alligator is an animal to be respected. Nonetheless, the Cushlans carry out their work armed only with their own sharp senses.
The little ones aren't on the nest, so that means they're probably in the grass someplace around here, so we're going to have to go looking for them. Marilyn? Yeah, there's one over here.
A little one?
Yeah. After they hatch, the mother and the little ones go off some distance from the nest itself, and she has a den in the marsh, and you can see right here, it goes down good 5 or 6 feet. And there was a little one that was right here, and what they do is they stay in this marshy vegetation rather than going out in the middle of a pond where they can get eaten by fish or birds or whatever. So the little ones are probably in this area here, and they're very good at keeping hidden. Well, this is the nest site itself. What happened in this particular nest, apparently, here's an egg that didn't hatch. Just no development at all in it. This nest was put down a little bit too low, and when the water level came back up after the rainy season began, it drowned out some of the eggs. So that's why there's only a few eggs scattered around the nest and others in the nest that didn't hatch out. And it's very critical for the animal to be able to predict water levels and how much water is in the area. What happens is that the alligator is a very sensitive indicator of water conditions. Its entire life cycle is geared to the rising and falling of water levels, and this in turn is geared to the changes in discharge. So that by opening up, say, the S12 structures north of the park at the wrong time of year, alligators who had built their nests at a low level because of low water levels would have their entire nesting season wiped out. So that what we're trying to understand here is why an alligator builds a nest at a certain location in a certain depth of water, a nest of a certain size, in order to correlate this with water conditions, so that when the time comes to actually regulate water, we'll know what not to do. There's one anyway.
Oh, I'm going to take him back to the boat. Okay.
You go ahead and take the measurements out. Write them down. 55 grams. Okay, enough. Okay. Total length, 11, even. Snout bent, 5 1/4. Nose to eye.
Nine.
5/8.
Okay.
Okay. That looks like a hole. Brown, blue, yellow, gray, brown. Okay, I'll let him go back in
You
the
want
hole?
to reweigh him?
No, that's all right. Let him go right where we found him. Right over where we found that one juvenile, the mother is probably very close nearby, and with the rest of her clutch. We just back off and let her take things her own way. It's really her home, and we don't like to intrude on it much more than we have to get the information we need.
Even while biologists like Jim Cushlan are trying to figure out ways to reverse the damage man has inflicted on wetland systems, man continues to try to dominate nature with little concern for long-range effects.
The vessel in the background is a large dredge that is used by the Deltona Corporation to move sediments from the bay bottoms and pile it up on the inshore areas to create living area. This is done usually on mangrove areas that have been prepared, and consequently the dredge moves the sediments on top of the old mangroves. The effect of this kind of development is, in my view, not in the best interest of Florida or of the public resources. It takes bottom sediments that are oftentimes quite healthy and productive themselves and pile them on top of mangroves that are productive and useful in their own right. And as a consequence, you deal a very severe 1-2 punch to the environment. You deprive it of habitat, which is very necessary for the support of the animal life. You deprive it of the source of food afforded by the grass beds and by the mangroves. Secondarily, after the bay bottoms are piled in upon the mangroves, they become residence locations, such as those that you see in the background here. And so an extremely productive unit is replaced by man's presence, which serves as a source of pollution. And so you deal the environment yet another stroke and cause problems that derive from sewage products, from the fertilizers that are put on the lawns, from the organic matter that comes away from these houses, and sometimes in the form of lawn cuttings and shrubbery clippings. In a whole host of ways, man tends to complicate and disrupt this area by his very presence. I'm convinced that people can live close by these areas and can make good use of the natural benefits that come from them, but you absolutely cannot cut off the sources of production and the means of supporting the animals that give it substance and value.
Unfortunately, as waterfront property becomes more scarce, it also becomes more desirable. Developers find no lack of buyers for the wetland acreage they continue to dredge, drain, and destroy. But of late, public recognition of the importance of preserving wetlands has halted some dredge and fill operations, at least temporarily. Construction workers who have lost jobs as a result of these building moratoriums have rallied to support land developers. And labor leaders from as far away as Washington, D.C. appear at hearings to urge that construction work be resumed.
If this project had not been stopped, 600 or 700 men would be on the job today.
At this hearing, AFL-CIO leader Robert Georgine makes his case before the arbiters of the conflict, an Army Corps of Engineers panel.
And the depression we now find ourselves in, we must encourage, not discourage, responsible, needed development.
Support for the development project arrives by the busload. Boosters are brought in from distant points to swell the audience.
I am proud to speak on behalf of the International Union of Operating Engineers. We all want to preserve and protect the mangroves, the shellfish, and all those wonders of nature with which this area has been so generously endowed. But in our zeal not to choke out the mangroves, have we not choked out the most important of all life forms, the human being?
Any man that would selfishly put 1,000 men out of work so that he could catch a tarpon or a snook isn't much of a man in my book.
But those who oppose this development also address themselves to economic issues.
First, and very important, is that the mangrove wetlands are some of the most productive natural areas on Earth. The complex animal food chains that result from all this lead upward to the higher levels where we find the animals that are important to man as food, recreation, and to satisfy aesthetic needs.
Based on a published study by the National Marine Fisheries Service, 85% of the commercial fish and shellfish harvested from South Florida waters consists of species that are dependent upon estuarine habitat during some phase in their life cycle. The majority of the southeast region's recreational fish species are also estuarine dependent. Combined, these species support a fish and tourist industry conservatively estimated to be worth about $600 million annually to local and state economies.
We can preserve this productive ecosystem and thus maintain the excellent sport and commercial fishery and abundant bird life of the region for the benefit of many succeeding generations. Or we can dredge and bulldoze this mangrove wilderness into a subdivision for the short-term economic gain of a private corporation and its employees.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. The difficult part of the defense of these areas is the fact that a developer can repeatedly request permission to make alterations, to dredge, to fill, and he only has to get permission once. And that area then is destined for change. If he succeeds in getting his permits, then that area is lost. It's a very frustrating thing for the conservationist because he has to win every time to protect an area. Time after time, the requests come in, and time after time, you've got to win, or those areas are lost. And they're lost permanently. They're not something that can be put back. It's an irreplaceable loss. And it's a loss of resources to you and to me and to everybody who enjoys the benefits that come by every year. Just as sure as there is a year, you get these benefits. These are the things that disturb me about our land management policies.
Our land management policies regarding coastal wetlands are not defined. A recent court directive to the Army Corps of Engineers mandates that the Corps consider impact on wetland ecosystems before granting dredge permits. But responsibility still lies with the public to express its will. This estuary, Rookery Bay Sanctuary, was saved from development only through the action of a group of citizens. When loss of this region seemed imminent, they rallied public support, raised money, and purchased the land. Then they donated it to the National Audubon Society to manage.
This area is not threatened, nor is the sanctuary threatened seriously by any developmental changes. We've actually seen some improvement in water quality since we've been here, and it's come as a result of keeping people informed of what some of the problems were with water quality and getting their cooperation.
Keeping people informed is a beginning, but more important, we need to develop a long-range management plan for these critical areas. Our most precious assets are those resources that are self-renewable. Our wetlands can serve us and our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren. Or we can destroy these wellsprings of unending supply to benefit a limited segment for a brief time. In the words of Henry David Thoreau, man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to leave alone. The wetlands demand nothing more of us.
The film you've just seen was made back